Hi, I'm Tom Needham, and on this episode of Sounds, I'm joined by James Corbett, one of the most compelling independent journalists of our time, and the founder of the Corbett Report. Known for his deep dives into geopolitics, history, and media manipulation, James joins me to discuss his powerful new book, Reportage Essays on the New World Order. In our conversation, we will explore his investigations into global power structures and what they mean for the future of individual freedom. James, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much for having me, Tom. Pleasure to be here.
Oh my goodness, you are a legend, and this book is incredible. I want to mention just in your introduction to the book, you have a piece by Whitney Webb, and she praises you. And I guess you've probably heard this before, but you have inspired a lot of people who are out there writing now and doing podcasts. How does it feel to hear from others that your work now has been influencing other people and has set the standard for others to follow?
Honestly, I'm tempted to say that that's the most gratifying feedback that I could get, but maybe that was really the entire point of why I started doing this in the first place. Not because I like the sound of my own voice or anything of that sort, but because this information was so important and I recognized its importance. I recognized also that it was not being presented to me through the usual media outlets, etc. So I just wanted to do my part to help other people see this information, have the transformative experience that I did with it, and then hopefully motivate them to get out there and do this. Because it has always been my belief that it's not any one individual ringing this alarm bell or raising points about these issues that is going to make a difference. It's going to be lots and lots of people stepping up to the plate and making use of this incredible revolution that we're living through right now, the online revolution, where suddenly the average Joe Schmo sitting in his living room in Japan can be reaching literally millions of people around the world with a message. That's an incredible opportunity. And I'm so gratified to hear when other people have been inspired enough by my message to take that up and start doing it themselves.
Well, it's incredible the journey you've been on. Maybe for people that don't know the whole story, can you tell us when you started and how the environment was different than it is today?
Sure. Well, the website started in 2007, but I guess the kernel of the idea of what became the website started in 2006, which is the story I tell in the first essay in the book about my experience here in Japan with a very normal, mundane, everyday event of moving into a new apartment that happened to have an internet connection in the apartment. Yay. Okay. So I had not had internet in my home since I left my parents' home several years before that point. And in the intervening years, all of these incredible new platforms had popped up, like YouTube and Google Video and what have you, that provided essentially instantaneous access to, if not every single thing in the world, at least a lot of different things, and a lot of things that I was interested in, but wasn't aware of. And me being a sort of politically interested person, I started to gravitate towards documentaries and other such things along those lines. And it wasn't long before I started finding information that was very, very different than what I had been taught in my school years. And me being the quizzical sort and not someone who's just going to believe anything that I hear or read, I was very interested to follow up some of these things I was learning by going to actual source material. And this being the age of the internet, I could do that. So I started falling down the proverbial rabbit hole in 2006 in a process, again, I describe in the first essay of the book. And from that point in 2007, I realized, wow, this is incredible information. I have to do something with this information. And perhaps if I had been living in my homeland of Canada at the time, I would have, I don't know, talked to friends, handed out CDs on the street. I don't know what I would have done. But being here in Japan as an English teacher, I thought, well, it's the internet age. I better start a website. And little did I know at that point in 2007, we were on the very low edge of this rising tide that was about to take off of the alternative online media space. And I had no idea that was coming. But hey, I started my podcast in 2007, years before Joe Rogan started his podcast,
Right,
years before the average person knew what a podcast was. And I
right.
was the beneficiary of that good timing, essentially.
You mentioned Japan and you mentioned that you're from Canada. Is the reason that you went to Japan to teach originally?
Essentially, I guess really the underlying reason was that I had just completed my master's degree in Anglo-Irish literature at Trinity College Dublin, and as I was winding up that degree and thinking about what to do with the rest of my life, I randomly encountered one of my fellow students in my course, and I asked him what he'd been doing, and he said he was looking up teaching English in Asia. And I thought, hey, that sounds like an idea. I can find it, see another part of the world, and I can go off and maybe earn some money to pay back this incredible student debt I've been racking up. And so I went online. The first thing that I found online, I applied, I got a job, and next thing you know, I'm heading out to Japan. I had never studied Japanese. I didn't know anything about Japan in particular. I just wanted to see a new part of the world. And the original plan was to just be here for a year, go home, and then start my real life, whatever that real job was going to be in Canada. And somewhere along the way, I guess I got hung up, and now I'm here, been here 21 years.
I do want to get to some of the information in the book, but I'm curious. I was an English teacher too, and I was wondering how long did you continue to teach as you started working on your journalism career?
Yes. So as when I started the Corbett Report in 2007, I was teaching at schools here in Japan in the public school system, and I continued doing that as my full-time job until 2011. And that's when I finally took the leap into doing the website full time. So there was about 4 years there where I was teaching during the days and then going home and researching and recording feverishly at night. And it led to a lot of sleepless nights along the way. But thankfully, I was able to build up enough of a base amongst my audience to actually go and out and do this full time for a living, which I've been doing for 14 years now.
That's great. And did you ever have any issues dealing with some of the topics that you cover, and people talking about what you were doing in school?
I never ran into that problem in particular, and I guess I'm saved by the sort of linguistic barrier because
Right.
Japan is pretty low on the list of English-speaking countries, and so I don't think any of my colleagues or bosses or anyone would have even been able to understand what I was saying, even if they knew about my website. So that was
Okay.
never really an issue.
Well, let's get into it. In the title of your book, you have essays on the New World Order. Let's start with New World Order. For people that don't understand exactly what that term is, what is the New World Order?
Well, interestingly, although that is the subtitle of the book, and obviously I would say what this book is about, I do not anywhere in the book actually define that term. And that was a deliberate choice because for me, it is a very loaded, very rich term with a lot of different facets. And I wanted, instead of simply coming up with a definition, I wanted to show various facets of this. But if people do want the sort of the deeper meaning of that phrase, it is a phrase with historical resonance and relevance, and you can go back to specific people who have used it in the past. For example, at the time of the end of World War One, going into the Versailles peace treaty, and then into the talks for the foundation of the League of Nations, it was a term that was being bandied about by Woodrow Wilson and his administration. We're creating a new world order, and in that from that time forward, it was picked up by people like H.G. Wells, who most people think of as a science fiction writer, but actually he wrote a lot of nonfiction, including a draft of what became the UN Charter of Human Rights and other such things. It was picked up as this rallying call, essentially for some variation, some form of world government or global governance, and it has been used in that context for well the the last century or so. It was picked up, for example, by the Nazis and Hitler in the 1930s, talking about the new world order they were trying to fashion with their Third Reich, and then it was picked up in the post Cold War era in the early 1990s, infamously by George H.W. Bush in his September 11th, 1991 speech, in which he was talking about a new world order is coming into view. And again, in that context, it was about surpassing the law of the jungle of each nation for itself and forging a new world order, some sort of world governance paradigm. And I think that's the core of this idea, the idea of centralization of power and control to its endpoint. What is the endpoint of the idea of centralizing power? Ultimately, to centralize it in some sort of global governmental institution. And I think that's the general thrust of the political process at a global level for the past half century, at least identifiably. And so I guess the question would be what would be opposed to that? And that is exactly what I tried to tackle in my essay on up down politics.
So, do you feel that there are people behind the scenes, maybe invisible to the public, who are essentially running things in the world? Or do you feel that's not the case and that there are individuals pushing to have a new world order where there would be that central control?
I think to some extent there is an admixture of both possibilities there. Insofar as I think there is not, I call it the comic book version of the conspiracy that there's a smoky room where 12 people are meeting at a table and deciding everything that happens in the world. I think that is self-evidently nonsense and quite clearly not the case. Having said that, there certainly are groups of powerful and influential figures that have obviously the ability to wield power across traditional national boundaries. And this, again, that you don't have to take this from myself. In the book, for example, I quote David Rothkopf, who was the head of Kissinger and Associates, a political insider, who wrote back in 2007, I believe, might be 2006. He wrote a book on superclass, talking about the 6,000 or so individuals who are essentially able to wield power across national boundaries and who are members of various elite institutions and things of that nature, some of whom are in positions in governments, but many of whom are not, are in private industry or in foundations or in think tanks or what have you, but have that sort of ability to create and influence a global agenda. And I think the perfect example of the use of that sort of power on a global level is exactly what we saw from 2020 on in the response to COVID-19. And what we saw with regards to that, of course, was a globally coordinated event in which, in fact, in the English speaking countries, a lot of the same language was being used in different parts of the world about, for example, surrounding social distancing, which entered the vernacular, but also build back better and these other types of phrases suddenly being deployed at a global level, almost as if there was a global coordination going on. And I think obviously, there are institutions that do have that kind of international agenda setting power, but fundamentally, I think what we are opposed to here, what is opposing us, is not a specific group of identifiable individuals so much as it is an ideology that what we need to strive towards is the centralization of power, that it is an inherent good to have these global institutions like a World Health Organization able to dictate the health policies of all these individual countries, because that makes it so much easier to coordinate during times of crisis, etc. And I think that is essentially what the New World Order is about. It's not a group so much as it is an ideology.
Hmm. So there seems to be a battle going on now where there are certain countries or individuals who are fighting for sovereignty. They're accused very often of being nationalists. And there are others who believe that the world would be better if there was a new world order and that sort of thing. Can you describe, and you have through the years and in your writing, can you describe this battle that's currently going on, or maybe it always has been going on to some extent?
Yes, well, we could certainly look back through history for examples of people who have articulated exactly that sort of struggle between the individual freedom versus the collective. And we could, obviously, Americans can look back at their history as to people like Thomas Jefferson and others who articulated that in the American context. We could follow that back through the Anglo philosophical tradition to John Locke and others. But I would actually say that in fact, I have an entire essay in the book, How to Really Defeat Globalism, which posits that binary of if you were opposed to the globalist vision, then you clearly are a nationalist. And I talk about how that binary is, in fact, a false dichotomy because they are both flavors of a form of collectivism. And the only question is essentially which flag are you saluting? And once you get people to say salute and pledge allegiance to a flag of their individual nation state, then you just have to, through a process of propaganda and conditioning over a course of generation or generations, you can just swap out the flag. And ultimately, okay, now instead of pledging allegiance to this flag, I'll pledge allegiance to the United Nations flag or whatever it may be. And so I don't think they are fundamentally opposed ideologies. They're just different flavors of collectivism. And in that How to Really Defeat Globalism essay, I talk specifically about the historical context of nation state and nationalist pride and where that idea comes from the Prussian system as articulated back in the 19th century. In after the stunning defeat of the Prussians at the hands of the French and the deep national shame that was being felt at that time, well, you started having people like Fichte and others coming together with this idea that, well, what we need to do is start conditioning the young people to essentially become great military uh, soldiers for cannon fodder for future wars for the
Mm.
greater glory of our nation. And in order to do that, we have to instill a sense of national pride and national patriotism. And that Prussian education system that resulted from that was transplanted everywhere around the world, including, as I can attest to, here in Japan, where you literally have the children in their military style uniforms lining up for the morning assembly, etc., and conditioned by the bells that a class will start and stop at various times. All of this conditioning, which was originally, as I say, for the conditioning of future soldiers for the Prussian state. And eventually that morphed in the early 20th century into the vision of, well, we need to condition most most young children. We need to condition them into the lives that they're going to lead uh, working in factories. So we have to condition them, for example, okay, the bell rings, you get your break, and then the bell
Mm.
rings again and you go back to work, et cetera, et cetera. And this was articulated very frankly by, for example, Woodrow Wilson back in the early part of the 20th century. We need to create two education systems, one for the average worker to condition them for their life of drudgery, and another for the people who will rule over them. So that is the roots of this statist idea, and I think that the national statism concept is not truly opposed to the globalist concept because they're both flavors of collectivism, of giving away your individual sovereignty to some sort of collective. And so I think the real answer to globalism is not nationalism. In fact, it is anti-authoritarianism at its absolute most basic level, the reclaiming of our individual sovereignty.
I remember here in America that it wasn't that long ago that there were people such as like Michael Moore who was making films, and a lot of the times that he was dealing with different topics, it was often related to globalization. And he was a liberal. I guess he's still a liberal, and he would make the case that globalization hurts workers in one's own country. Very simple kind of message. But then at some point, at least here in America, and I think probably around the world, that message sort of has jumped politically to the other party in terms of populism. All the stuff going on right now with tariffs and all that kind of stuff. Um, I know I'm overly simplifying it, but I was just curious to hear from you as to why different parties, if you even believe in the reality of different parties, um, why at different points do different parties seem to take on populist ideas, and maybe at some points they're in favor of globalization and at other points they're not.
It's an excellent question, and in fact speaks to a really important part of the political universe as it exists that actually is occluded from our attention most of the time, which is that, yes, isn't it strange, as you point out, for example, yes, the left concerned of the workers and their plight and concerned about the offshoring of and outsourcing of manufacturing, et cetera, the closing up of American productivity and manufacturing in the 1980s and 1990s. And now at this point, it's, yes, that has shifted to a concern on the right side of the political spectrum. Or we could look at any number of other issues in which similar flip flops have occurred. A decade plus ago, I'd say, it was, of course, associated with the left that corporations were the root of all evil, and that there were people marching, for example, march against Monsanto, against GMOs. questioning the science behind, for example, genetic modification, even questioning vaccines, etc. And of course, switch that forward a decade, and now it's exactly polar reversed. Now you have those exact same people who were marching against Monsanto are now lecturing their fellow countrymen who didn't take the medical interventions by the big pharmaceutical manufacturers. And now you have MAHA, which is this Make America Healthy Again movement that's now associated with the right side of the political spectrum, and questioning the validity or the veracity of the science from that is being propounded by these various corporations. What is going on? How do these incredible polar flips occur? And I would say it's because it is related to the fact that we are moving through political space, as it were, not through a single dimension, but through, at the very least, identifiably two dimensions. And the completely excluded part of the conversation, all we talk about is left and right. There is an up and down in politics. And so I did write an essay in here, Up Down Politics, specifically about that concept, that we are moving upwards, as it were, through political space, even as we're moving left or right. And the upwards is defined by the authoritarian urge, the centralization of power in fewer and fewer hands. The downward would be the opposite of that, the idea that that power should devolve back down to the individual. And because that up down has been excluded, we see these bizarre polar flips taking place and people completely reversing positions that they held even a decade ago. How did that happen? It's because left and right does not define the totality of the political landscape that we find ourselves navigating. And until we get a bit more accurate map of that landscape, we will be perplexed by such things. And once we start to really align ourselves in, at the very least, the 2D political space of the up, down, and left and right, then until we do that, we won't really have a sense of what's happening with pole flips like that.
One of the terms that you've written about is controlled opposition. Can you explain what that term is?
Well, controlled opposition refers to the idea that there are people who are in positions of opposition to whatever policy or whatever government may be in place who are not authentically against that thing. In fact, they are actually promoted by people in positions of power for one reason or another. Why would people in positions of power promote certain parts of the opposition? It may be because those people are amenable to only questioning so far, but not questioning underlying assumptions that are really essential to the overall game. And so, if you know that someone will only go so far, then it may be healthy, and even in a way beneficial for those people in positions of power to not only allow but even foster that sort of opposition. Look, you see how free and open things are. People can question us and they won't even be thrown in a prison or thrown in a Salvadorian prison or whatever the case may be. Um, for that purpose, then there are certain elements of people who appear to be opposed to power who may not actually be opposed to power. Having said that, I have also warned about the concept of, well, we have to put this in the context of cognitive infiltration. So back in 2007, 8, as just before Obama was elected, there was a professor, and I cannot remember which Ivy League institution he was a professor at this point, named Cass Sunstein, who wrote about the idea of cognitive infiltration. And this was the concept that in order to essentially undermine opposition and to nip conspiracy theories about events that are taking place in the bud, what people in positions of power could do is to infiltrate various groups and try to sow cognitive dissonance by providing, for example, information that goes counter to what these groups are saying. And Cassie Sunstein specifically said there are a couple of ways you could do this. One is you could have people who identify themselves as, I am an agent of the state, I work for the Treasury Department or whatever, and I can tell you this is not true, and I'll show you, here's a link to this document. You could have people who do that. But you could also have people who go undercover in
Right.
these groups in order to cognitively infiltrate. Don't admit that they are being funded by the government or that they're a government agent, but go into sow doubt in the ranks of these groups. Now, that's an interesting admission, not only because Cass Sunstein then went on to become Obama's information czar during his administration, But it's also interesting because one of the effects of even writing about that concept of cognitive infiltration is that once it becomes well known, as it did in alternative media circles in the early 2010s, then it becomes almost a contest among various people in the opposition of trying to spot the cognitive infiltrators.
Right.
Suddenly there's this term, and now everyone's looking, and everyone who disagrees with me is clearly a cognitive infiltrator who's actually a government agent. And it gives essentially perfect excuse for a divide and rule of the opposition. And in fact, this is a time tested historical tactic that was employed, for example, by the FBI in their COINTELPRO program, which ran in the 1950s and 60s to undermine various opposition groups that existed at that time, from the Black Panthers to the civil rights movement, etc. What they did in that program, this is documented historical record, they would put agents into various organizations that they wanted to undermine, and the agent would start accusing all of the various leaders of various groups, that guy's an agent, that guy's an agent. And of course, what that does is immediately sow dissent within the ranks so that opposition groups essentially fight with each other and provide no real opposition. And so there is a danger in dwelling on and focusing on who is controlled opposition and who is real opposition. If the conversation becomes about that, in a way, the opposition will always lose, because then it will simply be a carte blanche for people to say everyone who disagrees with me is an agent. Which is why I try my best not to dwell on trying to point to various figures in the either in the establishment media or the independent media, and to dwell on what they are saying and what they're not saying. And I think that this person's an agent, because I think at the end of the day, it is about what we can ultimately prove or not, or disprove, with actual identifiable evidential information, which is one of the reasons why there are several hundred footnotes in this book, is because I like to try to document what I'm saying so that you disagree with me all you want. How do you know? Maybe I am some sort of agent, but at the very least, here is all of the research that I use to compile this. You can see it for yourself and determine for yourself whether or not the puzzle pieces come together.
It's such a good point. I mean, that's what's going on right now. Everybody's calling each other out, and it's just a game, really. Just people are trying to figure out who's real and who isn't. And I see what you're saying. That can really just be just harmful in the sense that nothing gets done. Um, you have written to such a great extent about all the different methods that people in power have to control and manipulate, whether it's the media or the school system. Um, what of those different things has most interested you, and as you've learned things through the years?
Well, I've always been interested in media, but really in the last several years, I've really done sort of a deep dive on the history of mass media. In fact, I did an online course on the history of mass media. I did a documentary series called The Media Matrix, looking at the development of mass media and its effect on the public mind. And it's been fascinating to go through the history of the development of mass media, which I would locate in the 15th century from the Gutenberg Revolution on. Suddenly, and one way of putting your finger on that, I won't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but there is some estimate that in the first half of the 15th century, in all of Europe, all of the scribes working in the entirety of the continent were able to produce something like 20,000 manuscripts. And in the latter half of the 15th century, after the Gutenberg Revolution, I don't remember exactly what the number was, but it was something closer to 1 million manuscripts were
Mm.
produced, because, again, you could suddenly had this incredible proliferation of information. And that obviously that is going to change society on such a fundamental level. And many people have pointed out some of the historical developments that we can trace right back to the invention of the printing press, like the Reformation. Obviously, the idea that the average person could suddenly have this incredible voice allowed people like Martin Luther to come along and not only nail his theses to the door, but more importantly, to publish them and spread them widely. And suddenly you have the undermining of this 1500-year institution of the Catholic Church, and you start getting the Reformation. All of these wild and potentially subversive ideas start to get spread, which start to get people to question about not only religious authority but political authority, and you start to see kings and queens getting a bit nervous, as they should be, as civil unrest arises and the kings and queens start getting their heads chopped off and things along those lines. I think we can trace some of the origins of the Reformation, of those types of revolutions that were taking place in Europe in the subsequent centuries. We can trace that back to the printing press and that incredible change that took place there. Then you get into people like my fellow countryman, Marshall McLuhan, who is famous,
Mm.
infamous for the message, the idea, the medium is the message. But he wrote extensively about media and its effect on society, and he wrote about how it was an even more fundamental change as the population became more literate as a result of the fact that suddenly, well, books and texts are everywhere and easily producible. Suddenly, the average person, if not had a need, at least had the incentive to actually become literate. But that starts to change your perception of the world. And McLuhan points out, I think this is brilliant, but even the arrangement of literal lines of text, reading things from left to right, the breakdown of words, which previously most people would have interpreted and understood in simply an audio form. Now, when you're looking at them on the page visually, they are assemblies of letters which create these sounds. And the idea sort of starts to manifest in the broader idea that suddenly the world is now composed of these particulate bits of matter that can be broken apart and rearranged in the same way that the printing press, literally, you would break apart the I can't remember the name that they gave to that the form when they put all of the letters in order, and then they'd break them apart and reorder the page in order to
Mm.
print a new page. In the same way, suddenly, well, the universe itself starts to become like that, and you get the scientific revolution as a result of that. Suddenly, the world can be broken apart and rearranged and reordered to create new things. And so we start to get scientific revolution, etc. Now, this is a long-winded answer. I realize we're still in the 15th, 16th century,
Yeah.
but I think that that speaks to the incredible power that mass media has had on shaping and transforming the world around us. And I say, and I have said this for a while, I really do think that the internet, online, World Wide Web revolution is a revolution of similar seismic magnitude as the Gutenberg Revolution. We are living through an incredible proliferation of information. And in that regard, it's incredibly instructive to look at the ways that the kings and queens and popes and bishops and others who were threatened by the Gutenberg Revolution reacted to that revolution, because in some ways it's almost the same as what we're getting today. For example, in the wake of Gutenberg, there were various attempts at censoring the press, more or less successful. So, for example, in England, for example, you had um, at, at first the king and then Parliament trying to take over from the king the ability to censor the press by licensing the press. If you didn't have a license, you couldn't operate a press, and that persisted for, I think, something like a century. And that was, for example, what Milton and others were railing against at that time. But censorship of that ham-fisted variety, yes, it can be successful for a time, but people will generally find ways around it and will generally resist. So more effective by far is to, okay, well, let's take over this new medium and let's make sure that we are getting people to see what we want them to see. And the way that took place in the old printed mass media was the conglomeration of first these gigantic companies and then ultimately these conglomeration of companies that consolidated control over the press, to the point where by the end of the 20th century, famously, infamously, there were a handful, 5 or 6 corporations in America at any rate, that controlled 95% of what people read and saw and heard on a daily basis. And so in the 21st century, as we have this incredible proliferation of information on the internet that again threatens traditional structures of power, I think those traditional structures of power are reacting in similar ways. Of course, we have seen censorship, sometimes justified on the basis of misinformation and disinformation and what have you. But I think we're also seeing, again, the conglomeration of these gigantic corporate entities trying to essentially put the genie back in the bottle, put the toothpaste back in the tube by making everyone want to congregate on the same, say, 5 or 6 websites, which in most people's mind is the internet at this point. It's
Mm.
YouTube, it's Facebook, it's Instagram, it's these handful of websites have become the internet in the minds of most people, and essentially we're starting to see, okay, just as the 20th century media environment was completely contained by not by literal 100% ironclad censorship, but by simply the business economic arrangement of it, and everyone was happy enough to go along with it. We're starting to see a similar thing taking place online. So I'm trying to get people to understand that and its incredible world historical significance of the information revolution that we're living in, because it is ultimately, at least at this point, it is still our choice whether we're all going to go to Google and Meta and Insta and these types of places and give our identity over to these institutions to allow them to tailor and algorithmically control our news feeds, etc. Or are we going to take the initiative to actually seek this information out and connect peer to peer as the internet promised that type of connection? And ultimately, at this point, I think it's still our choice to make. And obviously, it's a lot harder to start to make choices to connect in decentralized fashion, but it can be done. And unless people see the reason why that is incredibly important for us to be doing, I don't think they'll be incentivized to do it.
I'm curious, as everyone's going on the internet, I'm sure you've been hearing, especially as someone who used to be an English teacher, that people are really losing their reading skills. Ivy League schools have been reporting that kids say they can't read books anymore. They can't give them the reading list that they used to. And does this not matter? Are we just moving forward with a new form of media, or is there something alarming about humans losing that skill, perhaps?
It certainly does make a difference. And whether that difference could be good or could be bad, well, that's up for every person to decide for themselves. But at the very least, we should be aware that it is happening. And it doesn't mean that it is a fundamental part of human nature to read. Obviously, there were pre literate, essentially pre literate societies. I mean, I would say essentially pre Gutenberg. Most of society, most of the time, was illiterate in the sense that they could not read. That did not make them stupid, of course. It just meant that they approached the world in a different way. And one could argue that we lost certain things when we went from an auditory society to a literate society, because back in the day, they used to memorize the Iliad and the Odyssey and be able to recite them. How many people can do that these days? I would venture to say not that many. So there are things to be said about the different ways that society propagates information and what types of societies result from that. So it's not necessarily a horrible thing if we move to a post literate society, as it's sometimes being called. Um, it is, I think, self evident that the visual sense is our primary sense for interpreting and understanding the world. And that has obviously there is a sense in which the word is itself a visual medium, but not in the sense of, well, we can directly portray images that will convey, as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So it's not necessarily that we're going to be losing information itself. Having said that, as I say, there are certain aspects of the written word and the way words are arranged on the page and our the way that we read from left to right and the way that we interpret and understand the world through those words that will be lost if we do move to a post-literate society and everything is simply visual and auditory information that's being presented to us in whatever our Oculus headset or whatever they come up with next. So I would say we would, at the very, very least, we should be aware that this process is going on and really have a cultural conversation about what it is from the literary idea that we want to preserve. I am, of course, biased, having grown up very much literarily inclined, that I think the written word is incredibly important. But I'm willing to at least engage in that conversation. I think we should at least be aware of this. Unfortunately, I think most people are, of course, just experiencing life, being washed from one event to another, not really thinking about it deeply, and not realizing that although people are spending the vast majority of their waking time in mediated reality right now with something I saw the statistic recently of 14 hours a day
Yeah.
that the average American is spending in some form of mediated reality or other in terms of having a screen, having earbuds in, talking over the phone, etc., whatever the case may be, which is just a mind blowing, almost unbelievable number. But I think, unfortunately, most people are doing that unconsciously, aren't even aware of the fact that they are staring at screens all day and that that is absolutely changing their perception of the world. And so my ultimate opinion on this is at the very least, if people are conscious and aware of the things that are happening to them, they would at least have a chance of mitigating any ill effects of that type of changeover.
You've critiqued power for a long time, and most people don't question the fact that there are powerful individuals who are either greedy or just seeking more power. But some of the topics that you've covered through the years are kind of dark, and there's no denying the reality of them. One of the topics that you cover in the book and have for years is the topic of eugenics and population control. And I was wondering if you could talk about those topics and how elites have viewed those things through the years and how it's affected the population in the past and how it may still affect us in the future.
Well, I approach it from the perspective that there has always been some sort of narrative of to legitimize the idea of political authority. In any given age, in any given era, in any given society, there's always a reason why such and such a person is in charge. And that narrative has changed over the centuries, over the millennia, as need be, based on the understanding of the general understanding of people in different societies. And so if you go back thousands of years, it was a very, very straightforward, very simple and simplistic story that anyone could understand almost instantaneously. The Pharaoh is God. Why does he rule over you? Because he's God. So worship him and do whatever he says. Well, that's a very simple answer. And it presumably worked to, for example, construct the pyramids or whatever. But there must be something more persuasive as society starts to wake up to the idea, well, maybe that guy isn't actually a god. I don't know. I've never seen him levitate above the earth or whatever. And so we see the development of that idea through the centuries, and we see the mandate of heaven in the Chinese society. We see the divine right of kings in Europe. By the time, however, we get to the Enlightenment society, as a result perhaps of that mass media revolution and the scientific revolution that took place as a result of it, we people are casting about for a more scientific rationale for political authority. Why should I listen to this or that person? And the answer that is presented to them, initially by Francis Galton, who coined the term itself, eugenics, is this idea that there are certain people with a certain something, a certain je ne sais quoi. So they called it protoplasm. They didn't even understand the mechanism of heredity at the time, but they thought that there was something that inhered in these rich and powerful and wealthy people that made them rich and powerful. That is why they are in these positions of power over you, is because they are inherently just better naturally, genetically. Although again, they didn't have the language of genes at the time that Galton was developing the idea. Um, and as a result, that becomes a pretty well something that explains everything. But as Karl Popper warned us, a theory that explains everything explains nothing. So why are poor people poor? Why are criminals criminals? Why are rich people rich? Why are powerful people powerful? It's because of their genes. And that, again, that's a very simplistic explanation. It is, of course, pseudoscience and total junk. But at the time, it was the rock star super science of its day. In the exact same way, climate science and global warming science has been the rock star super science of the late 20th, early 21st century. Back at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, anyone who was anyone was a eugenicist. And it was everyone from Teddy Roosevelt to you name it. They were all propounding this idea that there are certain people who are just better stock, better genes, and they deserve to have power and influence. They deserve to have large families and to spread their genes to the next generation. And the other sort, the poor, the criminals, the people who aren't so successful, well, clearly they have worse genes, so they should not be allowed to propagate into the next generation. And there is a couple of ways, once you come to that conclusion, there are a couple of ways of dealing with that. One of which is to, okay, we'll start to sterilize those people who shouldn't have children. And that's where you get the sterilization laws that were enacted in state after state after state across the US at the time, Buck v. Bell and other such momentous Supreme Court decisions, that was eventually transmitted over to Germany, who literally copied the sterilization laws from the US. The other, of course, dark specter of eugenics is dysgenics, the idea that, okay, we have to start literally eliminating these poor and defective genes from the gene pool. And again, if you're not going to do that through sterilization, well, perhaps easier to do that through literal depopulation, getting rid of those members of society that don't deserve to propagate their genes. Now, obviously, this entire idea was tarnished in the mid 20th century. Once the horrors of the Nazi regime were revealed to the public, people started to question, maybe, maybe this isn't something we want to be concerned with anymore. We don't want to do that. So, unfortunately, the fundamental idea of eugenics didn't die. It just morphed. And you literally saw that happening, for example, with the American Eugenics Society, just morphing essentially into the Population Council, founded by John D. Rockefeller III, literally in the same offices that the American Eugenics Society was using. They just changed the name on the door essentially to Population Council. And suddenly the big concern was overpopulation. Too many people having too many children. That's the problem, which coincidentally, happily, led to the exact same conclusion. Well, we need to start reducing the population. We need to start sterilizing people and or depopulating the earth. So essentially the entire idea just got transplanted and transmogrified. And I think that essentially as I document in the book, there's an essay about who controls the environmental movement that shows that all of the leading conservationist and environmental groups from the early 20th and mid 20th century, the World Wildlife Federation and what have you, were all founded by literal card carrying avid eugenicists. And that is no coincidence. And so that morphed into the obsession of the environmental movement with carbon dioxide and carbon rationing, limiting carbon, which, oh, by the way, happens to mean controlling and limiting the population. Again, happily enough for eugenicists. And I think in the 21st century, this ideology is morphing again to take a more technological flavor with technocracy, which again sounds great on its face. The idea that technical experts should be governing society because they know what's best. Unfortunately, as we've seen over the last few years, well, we know where that goes. So hopefully, people are a little bit more quizzical of people who say trust the science or I am the science, as Dr. Fauci infamously pronounced. People are perhaps a little bit wary of that, but still, I think it's an idea that kind of appeals to people's common sense. Of course, the rich and powerful and are probably there because they know what they're doing, so they deserve to rule over us. But essentially, it's the same story that the elitists have been telling the people they've been ruling over for thousands of years. That story just takes different forms in different eras.
Can you just clarify? Because I have a feeling that some people just are not familiar with the idea. I think people know that the ideas that you mentioned earlier are just not acceptable socially today. But you kind of implied that elites still believe in this philosophy, this idea, and that they're just implementing these ideas through different means. And you mentioned the whole climate change movement as somehow supporting the wishes of eugenicists. I don't think that's clear to a lot of people. How is um, fighting global warming going to lead to depopulation?
So one of the ways that I draw this out in the book is an essay on the strange life of Morris Strong, which, just in his biography, I think should give people who have never contemplated this at least a little bit of pause for thought. Why, why is this person who was celebrated at the end of his life as this incredible, unbelievable Herculean fighter for the environment, who not only founded the United Nations Environmental Program, but had an incredible list of achievements and honors and accolades and heads of various boards of all sorts of environmental organizations. How did how where did he come from? How did he rise up through the ranks? Oh, that's right. He was an oil millionaire by the time he was in his 20s, funded and sponsored and helped along by the Rockefellers, who you might remember I mentioned John D. Rockefeller III founded the Population Council, and it was his father, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was instrumental in the American eugenics movement and was sponsoring that movement. So there's another historical linkage. And one of David Rockefeller's proteges, Morris Strong, ends up becoming first an oil tycoon, making millions in the Alberta oil patch and elsewhere, and ultimately the head of Petro-Canada, the founder of Petro-Canada, et cetera, and then becomes this environmental crusader, the United, as if maybe he had some sort of revelation along the way. Oh, we're destroying the earth. We should preserve the earth. But actually, no, I think it goes quite deeper than that. And people will, for example, point out Al Gore and his oil money, not only from his father, but also the oil money that he sold out his media venture. I forget the name of his TV network, but he ended up selling it to rich Middle Eastern oil oligarchies for many millions of dollars. You start to see these connections as if there might be some sort of relation, for example, between the big oil oligarchs and the environmental movement. And that is, in fact, the entire purpose and subject of an entire documentary that I did, How and Why Big Oil Conquered the World, talking about the oligarchs for whom it was never about oil per se, it was about control, it was about power. And the best way to wield that power in the late 19th, early 20th century was to monopolize the oil markets. And of course, that made the fortunes of, even by today's standards, even adjusting for inflation, et cetera, the richest man who ever lived, at least that we know of in public, John D. Rockefeller Sr., the progenitor of the Rockefeller clan, was unbelievably, unimaginably wealthy by today's standards. So, what did he do with his wealth? Well, he started going into philanthropy and starting the Rockefeller Foundation, et cetera, as we know. And what did the Rockefeller Foundation do? Well, in the 1920s and 30s, it was funding all of the eugenicist work going on in America at that time. And in fact, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany, which kickstarted the German eugenics idea that resulted in the Nazi sterilization laws and other such things. But then in the 1940s and 50s, as I say, it was John D. Rockefeller III, the Rockefeller Foundation started concentrating on population as the big crisis facing humanity. And if the problem are too many people, the answer must be reducing the number of people. And there are nice ways of doing that by, say, sterilizing people. And there are less nice ways of doing that. But even then, so the population concern was wedded into the burgeoning environmental movement of the 1950s, the 60s. You start to get Rachel Carson and Silent Spring and the beginning of the environmental movement and environmental consciousness. And from that very inception, it was the World Wildlife Federation and the Rockefeller Population Council and others, the Morris Strong run United Nations Environmental Program, et cetera, that was steering that movement towards a singular purpose. Because let me be clear, there are many environmental problems on this planet, and there are serious ones. For example, genetic modification, the tinkering with the genome in this open air experiment that's going on around the world that I document in a different essay in this collection. There are real, genuine environmental problems, but the one that we have been asked to fixate and focus on has been the carbon dioxide, essentially climate change generally, but essentially carbon dioxide. And why is that? Well, I would posit it is precisely because, once again, the logic of this entire concept is that we must measure life in carbon, then we must ration and reduce that carbon. And the best way to do that is population control. And that word, population control, has multiple meanings and dimensions, one of which is the one that we associate. For example, a population council talking about having less children, sterilizing people, etc. But also population control, as in controlling what people can and cannot do. And we're starting to see what that manifests as we're being told, for example, about our 15-minute cities that will be wonderful because you won't be allowed to leave your 15-minute city unless given specific permission by the government. Oh, that would never happen, said people 5 years ago, until governments around the world started locking them in their homes. Or we, of course, have the eat the bugs agenda, where we're being told increasingly that protein of the future is not going to come from cows. Cows burp, and that is angering the weather gods. So what we must do is start eating cockroaches. This is totally obviously the way to go, and that will make the weather gods happy. When you start to deconstruct it at that level, the absurdity of it starts to come through. Unfortunately, most people have just been indoctrinated in this so deeply and for so long that they won't even begin to question that there may be an agenda behind these ideas. And certainly, I do not think every single scientist who is writing every single paper is in on this and part of some grand plot. No, I am sure there are a vast majority of these researchers are genuine people who are genuinely trying to do their jobs as the way they see it. But that such an idea could be steered towards a depopulationist motive, I think, again, should be clear to people who have not only looked at the history of this, but are looking at the pronouncements from various misleaders, including the ideas, for example, of carbon ration cards that were floated. For example, I point to a couple of decades ago in the UK, various MPs floating the idea that we need a carbon ration card that will allow you a certain amount of carbon credits essentially each month you will be able to spend to buy certain things, but once you get to that limit, sorry, no more meat for you. Now you got to eat the mealworms or what have you. And that sounded like crazy science fiction a couple of decades ago. I think people could see that is the way that things are trending, at least amongst the elitist class this day and age. So yes, I know it's a lot for people to wrap their heads around if they've never even contemplated this, but I would ask them to at least approach the book with an open mind and start looking at, if not me and what I say, at the very least, look at the references that I provide in essays like The Strange Life of Morris Strong and start putting those puzzle pieces together for yourself.
I mentioned Whitney Webb earlier, and she's written extensively about Jeffrey Epstein, and you've written about people like him for years. Um, can you just give us your take on why this man was not just meeting with politicians and business leaders, but also a lot of scientists? Did,
Yes.
what was going on in your opinion?
Yes, excellent question. Yeah, for people who don't know, there was a very strange story that came out shortly after Epstein didn't kill himself, in which it was revealed that he had some bizarre plot that he was working on to essentially seed the human race with his progeny. He was trying to sire as many children as possible on his New Mexico ranch, and he was recruiting various people to basically bear his children. It was a bizarre story that didn't get a lot of play at the time and has, I think, largely been forgotten since. But it adds up to a very intriguing part of the Epstein story that doesn't get told a lot about, but it's exactly that. Epstein was very much connected into a scientific network that included a lot of prominent scientists. And there are many, many pictures that go around of Epstein palling around with various scientists at various gatherings, etc., including Stephen Hawking
Mm.
at Epstein's Pedophile Island back in 2006. You can go look up that photograph. It certainly does not mean that all of these scientists were involved in whatever pedophilic activity Epstein was involved in. Uh, Presumably, some of them probably would have been caught up in that blackmail net. But it does speak to the fact that Epstein himself was genuinely interested in science and very specifically in eugenics, as evidenced, for example, by his bizarre plot to seed the race with his genes. Also, his support for very specific individuals and researchers, like, say, George Church, who, for example, he's a professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School, so a very above board kind of guy. But he not only talks about human life extension technologies by, for example, anti-aging genome engineering. What could go wrong? But he also talked about various other ideas, like eugenics. So, for example, he talked about creating DNA pairings to essentially forward the human race by getting people to stop these dating apps and hookups on Tinder or whatever. No, no, no. What you need to do is you need to go on these DNA pairing apps and find the right person for your particular DNA so that you can propagate the right genes into the future. And when he was called out on this, he did backtrack a little bit, but essentially the eugenics idea made its way into his circles, etc. There's all sorts of connections like that are fascinating, and as I say, were largely ignored. But I did write an entire article on that last year called Epstein Eugenics: The Plan to
Hmm.
Save the Human Race, that has lots and lots and lots of little pieces of information like that.
I know we don't have too much more time, but you mentioned blackmail. People, since learning about him, um, some people just feel like, oh, everybody's blackmailed, and that's the way they control our leaders. I'm sure it's not that simple, but can you give us your thoughts on how prevalent that sort of thing is worldwide?
There is no doubt that it has been a part of history for presumably as long as documentary records go. Yes, of course, blackmail, getting people in compromising positions who, if they weren't on your side before, well, once you have the blackmail on them, they will be. And that is just logically, it is most effective when the blackmail is of the most reprehensible sort. So, if it is, for example, about pedophilic activities, obviously anyone who is blackmailed with such information would do anything to avoid it, presumably. So, that explains that historical phenomenon, which has been documented for a long time, and also explains how networks like the one Epstein was associated with operated in the 20th century, certainly, and into the 21st century. But as Whitney Webb did very, very in voluminous detail in her book on One Nation Under Blackmail, as she did elaborate, essentially the Epstein idea, the Epstein network of compromising people in that way is no longer necessary because it is being taken over by big tech.
Hmm.
Big tech is now the middleman in absolutely everything you do, every transaction you make, every conversation you have, every place you go is being tracked, surveilled, and databased in real time by the NSA and other organizations, no doubt. And as a result, the types of blackmail situations that needed to be created by networks of power in the past, well, there's less of a need for it because they have absolutely every piece of dirt they could ever possibly want on any individual at the flick of a button at any moment. So I think as Whitney Webb has talked about, this is why the locus of power in society is very, very much shifted towards the big tech side of things. Those are the people who are now essentially doing what people like Epstein were doing in the past.
You mentioned Wells earlier. You write about Orwell a lot and Brave New World. Um, these writers who wrote these books of fiction, they really did have some insight as to what was coming, didn't they?
They certainly did. For example, Brave New World, Aldous Huxley. Well, Huxley would know a thing or two because his brother was Julian Huxley, who was, of course, a president of the British Eugenics Society for many years. He was also the founder of UNESCO, the founding document of which Julian Huxley actually wrote, which specifically says that one of the aims and purposes of UNESCO is to make eugenics a politically viable idea again, because it's been tarnished by those Nazis. We need to make eugenics thinkable again.
Oh my goodness.
Um, Also, of course, the Huxley family being part of the eugenics scene from its very inception, where the Huxley, Aldous, and Julian's grandfather was T.H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, so associated in with that Darwin Galton Wedgwood line from its very inception there in the late 19th century. So there are some deep historical linkages and reasons why someone like Aldous Huxley would know a thing or two about these. Huxley knew a thing or two and did research deeply about it. And just before he died, gave a lecture on the ultimate revolution, where he was talking. I would say, perhaps this is just my interpretation, but I would say with almost irrepressible glee about the prospect of the types of scientific interventions that are now available to would-be authoritarians that can make people not only do what they say, but actually to enjoy their servitude. So I write a little bit about that in the book. As opposed to that, I would put someone like an Orwell, who of course was Eric Arthur Blair, who whose own biography was quite interesting and who definitely came at it from the left side of the left-right aisle, but I think started to understand the deeper question of oligarchy and the forces that are controlling these seemingly opposed left and right forces. For example, when he went to fight in the Spanish wars in the 1930s, and he started to realize, oh, the Reds, the Soviet inclined part of the forces, they're slaughtering anyone who doesn't agree with them, anyone who would question the glorious Soviet idea, etc. And he went out and started to essentially warn about that through Animal Farm and others, warning about authoritarians of all stripes. So I think, yes, I think some of these writers very much did understand and know what they were talking about. And as evidence of that, I would just say it's almost impossible for me to avoid referencing Orwell at this point, because he said so much relevance to the world that we're living in, from doublethink and memory hole to all sorts of other concepts, which sounded maybe like strange science fiction at the time, but increasingly like mundane reality.
Well, James, the thing that's so great about your book is that you can really just hop around, kind of like we've been in this conversation, and just go to different topics that interest you, or you can read it straight through and you really start to put all these things together and get a really vivid picture of how life has really gotten to this point and where it's going. And no one does it better than you. If people want to learn more about your work, can you give us your website and tell us where we can find your book?
Yes, the best place to go for my work in general is corbettreport.com. That's Corbett report.com. That is the one stop shop for all of my work, and it's all posted there. I'm on Substack, I'm on Odyssey, I'm on Rumble, I'm on a number of platforms, not YouTube, because they decided to censor me several years ago, but I'm on many, many other platforms. But you can reach me at corbettreport.com, and that's the best place to follow me. If you want the book, the best place to go is reportagebook.com. But really, you can find it at literally any bookstore. All you need is the ISBN number, which is at reportagebook.com if you need it, and they will be able to order it for you.
Well, James, we'll have to have you on again one time. You mentioned throughout the program that you've made a lot of documentaries, and I interview a lot of documentary filmmakers. So you're welcome back anytime. But thank you so much. Congratulations on the book, and I wish you the best.
Thank you for having me on. I'm happy to be back whenever you need me.
All right. Thanks, James. Take it easy.
Take care.